good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Sam, and thank you all for joining. And what I would like to do today is take 15, 20 minutes or so just to provide a summary of my research, which was in Nunavut, Canada, and it was looking at prevailing environmental governance in the Canadian High Arctic and the adequacy of the current protectionist measures in terms of potential oil spill in the region. So this talk here captures the summary of my research. I'll present the findings, if you will, in two parts. The first part will be a background and overall setting the scene, if you will, the context for conceptualizing a new form of governance. And then the latter part of the talk will be on presenting a form of governance based on preemptive and precautionary logic. So I think we all know that there is mounting expression for increased partnerships for social change in the Canadian North and indeed all the Arctic region as it relates to environmental governance and marine protection. The voices of Indigenous peoples are, I would say, becoming increasingly heard, but still lacking in terms of participating involvement, engaged policy making and decision making. And one of the areas and a key aspect of my work in the Canadian High Arctic was looking at how in my case, Nunavut, is a political space, both in terms of policy shaping, in terms of the interface between cultures, values, and the understanding of what is important in terms of protecting the marine environment. And I think it's worth bringing attention, if you will, to the significance of the homeland for Inuit and the reliance that the Inuit have in terms of the marine environment and particularly ice. And given the changes in the Arctic as it relates to the melting ice and the changing profiles of marine conditions, tidal conditions, wave erosion, and so on and so forth, really is significant. And the work that is ongoing in the Arctic, in my opinion, is none too soon as it relates to looking at the protection of homeland for the Inuit of Nunavut.
Hi, Kevin. Just to interrupt, sorry, I don't currently see your screen in case you were intending to share it, but you're okay.
I'm sorry, is anyone seeing my screen at all?
Nope, me neither.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
I mean, your speech did a great job at painting the picture anyway.
I'm sorry. Let me. Are we seeing it? Are we seeing it now?
We are, yes. So maybe you can enter presenters mode.
Are you seeing that?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So I apologize, everyone. But what I was mentioning, these are the slides that I was referring to. So I'll go through them to get us back to where we are here. So the Northwest Passage, clearly is a navigable route today between the Northern Atlantic and the Northern Pacific. And it is a fabled passage as it relates to exploration and going back centuries in terms of trying to find the trading routes. Today, it is becoming increasingly a center for discussion, a center for concern as it relates to the opening of the navigable waters for trade, for tourism, for security. And this slide just captures, if you will, the confluence between environmental protection and how economic factors are becoming increasingly important in terms of the balance between trade, environmental protection, homeland security, and preservation of lifestyle for the Nunavut communities. On the left-hand side of this graphic here, you will see the Northwest Passage that goes through the archipelago of the Canadian Arctic. You will see the Northern Sea Route that follows the Russian coastline, and then the transpolar route that will go straight over the top. And as the ice melts, that is a route that will become increasingly attractive to minimize the times of voyages. There has been an attempt to take an oil tanker, the SS Manhattan, through the Northwest Passage. That was an experiment, if you will, to see if it was practical to move oil from the North Slopes of Alaska down to the eastern seaboard. And that's going back to the early 60s. Increasingly, security, there's active movement of submarines underneath and the waters of the Northwest Passage. And in 2016, the first cruise ship went through the waters. This is the area that this talk refers to. It's Lancaster Sound, and it's a very sensitive marine environment. It's a protected area, and it's one that is absolutely rich in marine wildlife. The Lancaster Sound is referred to as the eastern gateway to the Northwest Passage. And you can see here too how it enters the navigable waters off Baffin Bay, and then continues westward into the Beaufort Sea, the Canadian Beaufort, and then into waters west of there, the Chukch Sea. The yellow dots on this slide show the areas that I visited in terms of support for my research. And it includes visiting with the Norwegian Coastal Administration, University of Tromsø, London, meeting with the International Tankers Owners Pollution Fund, Alaska, meeting with Arctic researchers, and British Columbia, on Ottawa, and also California. And the reason for that was to get exposed to what is presently happening in terms of marine Arctic protection, and to see what lessons we can learn from various applications of marine protection, particularly from oil spill. And I particularly wanted to go to Norway and Alaska, where there are some really advanced technologies and some planning that is very preemptive and anticipatory of what could be adverse impact resulting from an oil spill. This is the area. This is particularly in Pond Inlet, looking across the Bylot Island. And the landfast ice attached to the land, the coast, and the multi-year ice and the first year ice and open water. The dynamics is changing. It's constantly shifting now. Landfast and multi-year ice is becoming less present, and first year ice and particularly open water, particularly now between June and October, more so than we have seen before. And what that is doing is allowing the planning, if you will, for the movement of trade, the movement of freight, tourism into the waters of northern Canada in the high Arctic. So moving into the second part of my short presentation is the meaning of place and the significance of place to those who North Baffin and Nunavut is their homeland, and how the meaning of place and the symbolism of place, I believe, should really be embedded more fully into environmental management, and how we look at that in terms of governance, and how we look at that in terms of bringing together the various voices, be it state, non-state, into the shaping of preemptive thought processes. And looking at this through governance framing, what is the role of Nunavut communities in the shaping of governments? What are the power dynamics at work in terms of being able to shape policy, being able to engage in how policy is developed, and particularly how it is implemented through the ability to bring in resources and knowledge and capacity to support, to this point, the federal government in its response to environmental protection. So I engaged with work of Manson, an epistemological scale, and the linkages between how we move from logical positivism into relativism, and really focusing on how we look at the construction of scale and emergent hierarchies to position new actors, new entities in government shaping, and particularly looking at in the construction of scale, the construction of knowledge, the construction of resources, and the construction of wellness and nature. So my work looked at this in terms of how we provide additional mechanisms, additional pathways for inclusion. And it looked at the existing data gaps that we have, or I observed, in present protectionist measures, and conceptualized how we could include knowledge and wellness and nature and resources, perhaps to be more proactive and forward-looking. This quite a simplistic chart just captures in the dash line how I depicted the interaction between the various entities that you see on this graph with the Government of Canada. And the solid black line depicts how the governance framework that you'll see in the next couple of slides positions some of these new actors, these new entities, these new non-state entities, territorial entities into governance. You can see a very, very clear shift for the inclusion of the Government of Nunavut, Nunavut communities, and also bringing in NGOs as well. There's a lot of work being done right now, particularly by World Wildlife Canada, and its work was very useful in terms of stepping back from existing governance and see how that could be reshaped going forward. So this graphic here shows where we are today in terms of existing governance of North Baffin. Going through the gap analyses, as I mentioned earlier, and then really dropping down to the bottom in terms of, where is the will, where is the ability to really affect change as it relates to positively disrupting existing governance, and looking at how policy shaping and decision-making is made, looking at how the knowledge and the well-being can be aligned with shaping and decision-making, and then also moving to the right, how that can be coordinated and operationalized through the construction of resources. And this is the conceptualized governance that I'm suggesting, whereby we have greater inclusion of North Baffin communities through the establishment of a new entity, and also coastal groups, again, made up of Nunavut community members, and also a shoreline cleanup team. This is a model that is used very effectively in Norway, and to a lesser degree in Alaska. It has a different form in Alaska, but the concept is very similar in terms of village engagement. And then looking at how we bring into all of these discussions well-being. and really engaging with a concept of ecological grief. When you lose your resources, when you lose the ability to fish, to hunt, when you see the ice in front of you changing, what does that do in terms of wellness and overall community well-being? So engaging with ecological grief, and the work of Consolo was very helpful here in terms of being able to position wellness as a new construct in governance. So this conceptualized outline here is one that I believe is transformational in terms of moving to a point where we can anticipate, we can preempt what may happen to communities. When we look at the Gulf of Mexico, when we look at Prince William Sound, good work has been done as it relates to how we can involve the communities, and learning from those lessons, how we could position really good sources of knowledge and capacity to mitigate potential impacts going forward. So I refer to directional paths towards operationalized governance. And again, a big part of my work and my hope is that this is not just something that is on a shelf. This is something that can be mobilized. This is something that can be tested as it relates to inclusion of Nunavut communities, working very closely with the Government of Canada in the protection. So essentially the conceptual model is one that is still very institutionally led, but bringing in constructionist ideals. So it's a hybrid, if you will. It's a combination as to how we use the ability of government to bring in and position those communities, those actors, those entities that can really enable practical governments. It's a purposeful shift in how we look at spatial dimensions, how we can accommodate temporal dimensions as it relates to what may happen in 5 years, 10 years, 1 year's time in terms of ice, in terms of climate change, and how all of that can then be linked to functional governance that can accommodate the nature of emergent risks. If you will, it softens the Western style top-down hierarchical approach through greater inclusion of those who I suggest have not always been at the table as it relates to governance. But it does require, in this case, the governments of Canada to be engaged in discursive processes and to really look to see how we govern distant areas and how we govern in the context of emergent environmental risks. It requires us to bring the future forward, picking up on Anderson's work in terms of what is the morality of precautionary logic and preventative measures? If not now, when? And I think that's a really important question for us to ask always when we're shaping governance. If not now, when? And ecological grief, adverse wellness, let's confront that. Let's bring that into our thinking and our thought processes so we do not consider it an afterthought. Let's put it up front there. And is cost-benefit analyses always the way to go in terms of governing emergent risks? Or are there other factors that we should be considering that perhaps don't lend themselves well to financial modeling or cost-benefit decision-making? And then looking at the ethical principles, looking at appropriate contact and how we accommodate our thought process of governance in the setting in which we are looking to govern a very challenging situation. The desired outcomes of certainly my work is greater inclusion of Nunavut communities in the protection of the Canadian Arctic, and to elevate the awareness that Western-style governance elements may be very appropriate. Indeed, they are in terms of resource commitment but not always appropriate when we have more distant challenges and remote environments and lifestyles to accommodate. And I'm, in conclusion, suggesting that we look at ecological grief, not just in the protection of the Canadian high Arctic, but also on a global basis, in terms of when we have remote communities, Indigenous groups being exposed to climate change. Are we, as a community, accommodating ecological grief sufficiently? And I think that's a question that I'd like to leave with all of you. So thank you for listening to the presentation.
Well, thanks very much, Kevin. That was great. And of course, I would like to welcome questions now. So if anyone has any, please raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. And I can either read it out for you or invite you to do so yourself. But while we're waiting, oh, we have a question from Maria. Let's go to Maria. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, sorry, the lighting is terrible in this office. A really great talk, thanks. I was just wondering what you're saying about ecological grief. I've heard of this before, and I'm wondering, is it already kind of included or taken account for in kind of Canadian sort of regional or national health and social care frameworks, or is it very much still, you know, is it being considered practically with these northern communities, or is it still kind of theoretical at this point?
I think it's increasingly being developed, and really, you know, it brings human health, environmental management together. And a lot of the work has been done not directly in the sense of marine protection, but in terms of other exposures to grief. So it could be polar bear hunting, the decline of polar bears. What does that mean in terms of lifestyle? So I think based on the research that I was doing, it's been brought to our attention, the community's attention over the last 10, 15 years. More recently, the linkages between climate change and ecological grief are becoming more pronounced. And I think that's a very, very good development. So is it theoretical? I'd like to think it's moving to the practical from theoretical. The sense that I have is that we need to elevate it more to those in government and to elevate it more to those who are in a position to look, to see whether or not wellness and the protection of lifestyles is adequate. And what may have been adequate 10 years ago in some parts of the world, in the case of the Canadian Arctic, is not adequate, because we all know what's happening up there. And having spent time up with the communities of Nunavut, there's real concern about their lifestyles going forward. So I think it has to move from the theoretical into the practical, and I believe that is happening. But it's not just one discipline that can address this. I think it's the political, I think it's the human health, I think it's the environmental, I think it's the risk assessment, the risk analyses. So a whole broad multidisciplinary response is needed to elevate it more fully in policy shaping, decision making, and particularly what I refer to operationalized governance.
Thanks, that's really interesting.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Kevin, for the answer. On that note of taking something which you know, might be somewhat theoretical and trying to realize it, Kevin, you've identified quite a few practical solutions or desired outcomes in your work, and I was just wondering what the feedback you've had, if any, yet from people in government or other practitioners has been on your work, and what do they see as the barriers, if any, to introducing some of these things?
The next development from my work is to provide a summary paper that will be submitted to the Government of Canada. As part of my work, I spent time in Ottawa, and I met with a senator from Nunavut, Dennis Patterson, and he was particularly supportive of how we can look at communities, the Canadian Rangers, in governments. So my plans going forward, in response to the question, Sam, is to consolidate my work, present it in a concise format that will allow decision makers to reflect on, is there something here? I believe there is, but is there something here in terms of how we can shape policy going forward? I think there's an absolute awareness that the changing conditions in the Canadian Arctic require us to be very mindful as to what has worked historically and may not be adequate going forward. So the pathways that I am considering at the moment is moving from what is quite heavy on the academics into something that is functional, that is practical, and for those that are responsible for protecting the North to be able to contemplate how elements of, and it may not be as presented here, but it could be concepts, it could be thought processes that allow for different ways to think about environmental protection and community well-being.